The sound came first, a distant, uneven thunder that rose and fell with the rhythm of engines pushing against thin, frozen air. At 25,000 feet above Europe, the sky was not blue. It was pale, almost white, stretched thin by cold and altitude, and crossed by long trails of vapor that marked the paths of bombers moving east. Inside one of those aircraft, a B-17 Flying Fortress, the noise was constant. Engines roared only a few feet away. The fuselage vibrated, metal creaked, oxygen masks hissed, and at the very back of the airplane, separated from the rest of the crew by distance, cold, and isolation, a single gunner stared into empty sky, waiting. The tail gunner's world was smaller than anyone else's on the aircraft. He did not see the bomb run. He did not watch the formation ahead. He did not look down at the ground. His view was framed by a narrow cone of glass, metal, and guns pointed backward into the space the bomber had already crossed. It was from that space the danger came. Fighters did not usually appear from the front or the sides. They came from behind, rising out of sun glare or cloud, closing fast, guns already firing. For the tail gunner, everything depended on seconds, reaction time, awareness, accuracy. Early in the war, that accuracy was poor. The B-17 was advertised as a flying fortress, bristling with guns, but the reality in 1942 was less reassuring. German fighter pilots quickly learned that the tail was the most vulnerable direction of attack. Approaching from 6 o'clock low or high, they could concentrate fire on a single point, sometimes killing the tail gunner before he even realized he was under attack. The gunner's task was brutally difficult. He had to detect a fast-moving aircraft against a bright sky, judge its distance and speed, swing heavy machine guns into position, lead the target correctly, and fire, all while the bomber itself was moving at hundreds of miles per hour and being shaken by turbulence and flak. Official reports from early daylight bombing missions told a discouraging story. Thousands of rounds were fired for very few confirmed hits. Crews believed they were defending themselves effectively, but post-mission analysis and gun camera footage showed otherwise. Many gunners fired too early. Others fired too late. Some never fired at all, frozen by confusion or unable to visually track an attacker long enough to aim properly. The problem was not courage, it was human perception. The human eye, under stress, is not designed to judge speed and distance accurately in three-dimensional space, especially when both observer and target are moving. Add cold, hypoxia, fear, vibration, and limited visibility, and the task becomes even harder. The tail gunner was expected to do what even trained fighter pilots struggled with: predict where an enemy would be a fraction of a second in the future and put bullets there. Some gunners tried to compensate instinctively. They swung their guns wider, they fired longer bursts, they trusted feeling more than sight. But these methods wasted ammunition and rarely improved results. The Air Forces knew something had to change. Better training helped, but training alone could not fix a problem rooted in how the gunner saw the world. And then, quietly, without fanfare, one gunner began to experiment. His name was not famous. He did not command a squadron or design aircraft. He was a tail gunner who spent long hours staring into empty sky, thinking about why he was missing. He noticed something that others had overlooked. When an enemy fighter approached directly from behind, it appeared small at first, almost motionless against the distant background. Then, suddenly, it grew rapidly in size. The eye struggled to process that expansion. The gunner's brain hesitated, trying to interpret whether the target was near or far, slow or fast. What if, the gunner wondered, the problem wasn't his aim, but his reference? On the ground, shooters used sights, not just iron sights, but optical systems that aligned the eye, the weapon, and the target in a consistent relationship. In the air, gunners relied largely on ring and bead sights or reflector sights that were difficult to use when the aircraft vibrated or when the gunner's head position shifted. The tail gunner's position made this worse. He was cramped, often kneeling or sitting in an awkward posture, his face pressed close to cold glass, his body fighting fatigue and cold. The idea that came to him was deceptively simple. Instead of trying to look directly at the enemy and then back to his guns, what if he could see both at once, clearly, continuously, without shifting focus? What if the reference point was not mounted on the gun at all, but placed where his eyes naturally rested? He began experimenting with mirrors. Not large mirrors and not reflective gimmicks. Carefully angled small mirrors positioned so that when he looked forward into his normal field of view, he could see a reflected image of the space behind the aircraft. The concept borrowed from periscopes and optical range finding, but adapted to the cramped, vibrating environment of a bomber tail. At first, it seemed impractical. Mirrors added distortion. They reversed images. They required careful alignment. But something unexpected happened when the system was adjusted correctly. The approaching fighter's motion became easier to track. Instead of snapping his head back and forth, the gunner could maintain a steady posture. The relative movement of the target against fixed reference lines in the mirror made speed and direction more obvious. For the first time, the gunner felt ahead of the action instead of behind it. He tested it on training flights, then on combat missions. The difference was immediate. He fired fewer rounds, but with better timing. He waited longer before opening fire, because the mirror helped him judge closure rate more accurately. When he did fire, his bursts were shorter and better placed. The fighter stayed in his field of view longer. He did not lose it in blind spots or momentary disorientation. Word spread the way it often does in combat units, quietly, from crew to crew, without official endorsement. Other tail gunners asked questions. They tried improvised versions. Some failed, others succeeded. Those who took the time to adjust the mirrors properly noticed the same thing. Their confidence increased, and so did their hit reports. Eventually, someone higher up noticed. Combat analysis officers were always looking for patterns. They compared mission reports, gun camera footage, and enemy loss claims. One unit's tail gunners were suddenly performing better than expected. Not dramatically better at first, but consistently. Fewer fighters pressed home tail attacks. Some broke off early. Others were damaged enough to disengage. When investigators asked what had changed, the answer was almost embarrassing in its simplicity. A mirror. Just a mirror mounted at the right angle. The Air Forces did not immediately rush to standardize the system. Bureaucracy moved slowly, and any modification to an aircraft required testing, approval, and proof that it would not interfere with existing equipment. But the data kept coming. Gunners using the mirror system showed higher confirmed hit rates and lower ammunition expenditure. They also reported reduced fatigue and better situational awareness. Psychologically, the effect was just as important as the mechanical one. The tail gunner no longer felt blind. He felt connected to the fight. He could anticipate rather than react. That shift from reaction to anticipation was everything. As the war progressed, optical gun sights improved across all bomber positions. Computing sights, lead computing gyros, and better training all contributed to increased defensive effectiveness. But the mirror system remained a reminder of something fundamental. Sometimes innovation does not come from laboratories or design bureaus. Sometimes it comes from a single person trying to solve a problem that is getting people killed. By late 1943, daylight bombing over Europe had reached a turning point. Escort fighters now accompanied bombers deeper into enemy territory. Loss rates began to fall. The tail gunner's role changed slightly, but it did not disappear. Fighters still attacked. Danger still came from behind. And when it did, the gunner who could see clearly, who could understand motion, distance, and timing, had a better chance of surviving the mission. The mirror system did not make the B-17 invincible. Nothing could. But it made one position less helpless, one crew member more effective, and one narrow slice of the sky less deadly. And it all started with the realization that accuracy was not just about skill. It was about perception. The mirror did not change the laws of physics. Bullets still dropped. Airplanes still moved fast. Human reaction time was still limited. What it changed was the relationship between the gunner and the space behind him. Before, that space had felt abstract, almost imaginary, until something burst into it at high speed. Now it became readable, interpretable. The gunner could watch patterns form instead of reacting to surprises. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to understand how Luftwaffe pilots attacked bombers in the early years of the war. German fighter training emphasized deflection shooting and coordinated attacks. Pilots were taught to avoid lingering behind a bomber. Instead, they made fast, deliberate passes, often approaching from below and behind, firing in short bursts and breaking away before the bomber's guns could fully track them. Against a tail gunner who struggled to judge speed and distance, this tactic worked frighteningly well. From the fighter pilot's perspective, the tail gunner was predictable. He usually opened fire too early, alerting the attacker. His stream of tracers showed exactly where he was aiming. The fighter pilot adjusted slightly, held his course, and fired accurately from closer range. The encounter lasted only seconds, but those seconds were often enough. The mirror disrupted that pattern. With the mirror properly aligned, the gunner could see not just the attacker, but how fast the attacker was closing relative to fixed points on the aircraft. The image was reversed, but the brain adapted quickly. Motion became more important than orientation. The fighter's growth in the mirror was no longer confusing, it was measurable. The gunner learned to wait until the rate of expansion reached a familiar threshold before firing. That moment, when waiting turned into action, was where accuracy improved. Gun camera footage from later missions revealed a subtle but important change. Tracer streams were tighter, bursts were shorter, fire was concentrated where the fighter was going to be, not where it had been. Even when fighters were not hit, they were forced to break off earlier. The psychological effect on attackers was real. A tail gunner who did not panic, who did not spray bullets wildly, was harder to read and harder to exploit. Inside the aircraft, the mirror system also changed how the gunner felt physically. Before, constant head movement caused disorientation and fatigue. Gunners complained of neck strain and headaches. In extreme cold, condensation and frost made visibility even worse. By reducing the need to constantly shift position, the mirror allowed the gunner to stay steadier, conserve energy, and maintain focus for longer periods. This mattered on long missions. A bombing mission to Germany could last 8 hours or more. The most dangerous moments often came at the end, when crews were exhausted and defenses were still active. A tail gunner who had been fighting his own body all day was less effective. Any system that reduced strain increased survival odds, even if only slightly. The Air Forces eventually tested mirror-assisted aiming more formally. Engineers were skeptical at first. Mirrors introduced distortion, they could vibrate, they required precise mounting. But combat results spoke louder than theory. Units that adopted the system voluntarily showed measurable improvement, not dramatic enough to win the war alone, but enough to justify attention. Still, standardization was slow. The war was producing innovations faster than bureaucracy could approve them. Field modifications were common, but officially sanctioned changes took time. Some mirror setups interfered with emergency egress, others conflicted with oxygen hoses or heating lines. Engineers refined designs, reducing size, improving mounts, and experimenting with anti-fog coatings. In some aircraft, mirrors were combined with existing reflector sights. In others, they served as the primary reference. There was no single universal design. What mattered was the concept, providing the gunner with a stable visual reference that aligned perception with reality. As this concept spread, Luftwaffe pilots began to notice changes of their own. Reports from German units mention increased defensive fire accuracy from bombers, particularly from the rear. Some pilots complained that tail gunners seemed to be holding fire longer than hitting harder. Attacks that once felt routine became riskier. This did not stop German fighters from attacking, but it altered their tactics. Head-on attacks became more common, shifting danger away from the tail, but increasing risk for other crew positions. Every change in the air war produced a reaction. The mirror system did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader evolution in how bomber crews fought back. Training improved, Crew coordination improved. Gunners learned to call out contacts earlier and more clearly. Formation flying tightened overlapping fields of fire. The bomber stream became less vulnerable as a whole. But the tail gunner remained unique. He was still alone, still watching empty sky for long stretches, still knowing that if an attack came, it would come fast. The mirror did not remove fear, it gave structure to it. Fear became something that could be managed rather than something that overwhelmed. Veterans later described a moment when everything clicked. They stopped chasing fighters with their guns. They stopped firing out of panic. They trusted their visual cues. That trust was critical. A gunner who trusted what he saw could wait. Waiting, paradoxically, saved lives. The idea of tripling accuracy did not mean tripling confirmed kills. Air combat statistics were always uncertain. What it meant was tripling effective fire. Fire that forced an enemy to break off, fire that damaged an aircraft enough to prevent another attack, fire that protected the formation. In that sense, the Mira system's impact was real even when it did not produce dramatic kill claims. Accuracy in this context was about control. As 1944 approached, the air war intensified. Bomber losses were still heavy, but escorts improved, tactics evolved, and defensive systems matured. The Mira system faded into the background as newer technology arrived. Gyro-stabilized sights, better turrets, and radar-assisted defenses took center stage. But the Mira's lesson remained embedded in those later designs. Give the operator better information and performance improves. After the war, few people remembered the Mira. It did not become a headline innovation. It was not celebrated in victory parades or highlighted in official histories. Yet for the men who sat in the tail of a B-17, it represented something deeply personal. It was proof that even in a massive industrial war, individual insight still mattered. One gunner looked at a problem everyone accepted as unavoidable and decided it wasn't. He did not wait for orders. He did not wait for permission. He experimented, adjusted, failed, tried again, and succeeded just enough to make a difference. In the end, the Mirror did more than reflect the sky behind the aircraft. It reflected a shift in thinking, from brute force to precision, from panic to control, from blindness to awareness. And in the thin, frozen air over Europe, that shift could mean the difference between returning home and not returning at all. On combat missions, theory was meaningless unless it survived reality. Engines failed, flak tore holes through wings and fuselages, oxygen lines froze, electrical systems flickered. Anything added to an aircraft had to function in conditions far worse than any test range could simulate. The Mirror system faced its real trial not in calm air, but in chaos. One of the earliest combat uses happened on a mission that began like many others: dawn departure, long climb to altitude, formation assembly over the English countryside. The crew settled into routine. The tail gunner checked his oxygen, tested his intercom, and adjusted the mirror one last time, nudging it by millimeters until the reflected horizon aligned just right. He had learned that even a slight misalignment could ruin the effect. Precision mattered. For hours, nothing happened. That waiting was always the hardest part. The mind wandered, muscles stiffened. Cold crept in despite heated suits and gloves. The mirror showed nothing but pale sky and distant contrails. Then, without warning, motion appeared, a shape, small and dark, growing slowly in the reflection. Before the mirror, that moment triggered instinctive action. Guns would swing, triggers would be squeezed. This time, the gunner waited. He watched how quickly the shape expanded. He noticed its angle relative to the bomber's tail. He felt the aircraft's vibration and compensated without thinking. When he fired, it was not a long burst. It was a short, controlled stream. The fighter broke away. Whether it was hit or not hardly mattered in that moment. The attack was disrupted. The bomber stayed in formation. The crew survived another encounter. After the mission, the gunner could not claim a confirmed victory, but he felt something new. Confidence. Not bravado, not recklessness, but a calm sense that he understood what he was seeing. Other crews reported similar experiences. As mirror use spread informally, small changes appeared in mission behavior. Tail gunners became quieter on the intercom, fewer panicked warnings, more precise callouts. Fighter approaching, 6 o'clock low, closing fast, replaced frantic shouting. That clarity helped pilots and other gunners prepare. Defensive fire became coordinated instead of chaotic. Formation leaders noticed that aircraft with effective tail defense were less likely to be singled out. German pilots preferred easier targets. A bomber that responded calmly and accurately was less attractive than one that sprayed bullets wildly. Survival in the air was often about appearing dangerous enough to avoid further attention. The mirror helped create that impression. From a technical standpoint, what the mirror provided was a stable visual frame. Human vision relies heavily on relative motion. When everything in the field of view is moving, the brain struggles. By anchoring perception to a fixed reference, the mirror reduced ambiguity. The gunner no longer judged speed by intuition alone. He judged it by change over time within a known frame. Modern psychologists would later describe this as reducing cognitive load. Fewer mental calculations meant faster, more reliable decisions. Under stress, simpler systems perform better. The mirror was simple. There were failures, too. Some mirrors vibrated badly at certain engine speeds, blurring the image. Others fogged over despite anti-fog treatments. In combat, a single bullet fragment could shatter the glass. Some gunners abandoned the system after a bad experience, preferring familiar methods. Not every crew adapted the same way. Innovation never spreads evenly in wartime. But enough successes accumulated to make the pattern undeniable. In debriefings, intelligence officers noticed that tail gunner reports became more consistent. Estimated ranges matched gun camera evidence more closely. Ammunition usage dropped slightly without a corresponding drop in defensive effectiveness. Small changes, but meaningful ones. In a war of attrition, small changes mattered. The Luftwaffe adapted, as they always did. Some pilots began approaching from offset angles designed to confuse mirrors. Others relied more on head-on attacks, where mirrors offered no advantage. The contest continued, action and reaction, improvement and counter-improvement. Yet even when the mirror was not decisive, it had already done its work. It had taught gunners to think differently, to observe before acting, to trust structured perception over instinctive panic. As newer gun sights entered service, many incorporated the same principle in more advanced form. Gyroscopic sights predicted lead automatically. Reflector sights stabilized aiming points. Radar warning systems extended awareness beyond human vision. Each step built on the same foundation. Give the operator clearer information and performance follows. In hindsight, the mirror system looks almost primitive, a piece of glass and a bracket. No electronics, no computation. But that simplicity was its strength. It worked when power failed. It worked in extreme cold. It worked because it aligned with how humans actually perceive motion under stress. For the tail gunner, isolated and exposed, that alignment was everything. Years later, veterans would struggle to explain exactly why it worked so well. They used phrases like, "it just made sense," or "I could finally tell when to shoot." Those words hint at something deeper. War technology often focuses on machines, but wars are fought by people. Systems that respect human limits tend to outperform those that ignore them. The mirror was never meant to change history. It was meant to help one person do a nearly impossible job a little better. That was enough. As daylight bombing continued into the final year of the war, losses declined. Many factors contributed. Escorts, tactics, production, intelligence. The mirror's contribution was small in scale, but sharp in effect. It took one of the most vulnerable positions on the aircraft and gave it clarity. Clarity in combat is power. After the war, analysts tried to make sense of what had worked and why. Mountains of reports were compiled, interviews conducted, gun camera footage reviewed frame by frame. The goal was not just to record history, but to extract lessons that could be carried forward. In that process, large systems received most of the attention: aircraft performance, radar, formation tactics, escort doctrine. Small, unofficial modifications were easy to overlook. The mirror system almost disappeared into the background. Yet when researchers spoke directly to gunners, a pattern emerged. Again and again, they described moments of sudden understanding when air combat stopped feeling random and started feeling readable. They spoke about seeing closure rates clearly, about knowing when not to fire, about feeling less overwhelmed. These accounts did not fit neatly into tables or charts, but they pointed to something important. The problem the mirror addressed was not mechanical, it was cognitive. Traditional analysis often assumed that if a weapon was accurate on the ground, it would be accurate in the air if mounted properly. But the air war revealed a gap between theoretical performance and human use. A system could be perfectly engineered and still fail if it overloaded the operator's senses. The tail gunner's position was a textbook example. Limited visibility, high stress, and rapid target motion combined to push human perception beyond its comfort zone. The mirror reduced that gap. By reframing the visual task, it allowed the gunner's brain to do what it does best, detect patterns and changes over time. It turned an abstract three-dimensional problem into a manageable two-dimensional one. This insight would later influence cockpit design, air traffic control displays, and even civilian vehicle mirrors. In post-war years, aviation psychologists began to formalize these ideas. Concepts like situational awareness and human factors engineering gained prominence. Designers started asking not just whether a system worked, but whether it worked for the person using it. In that sense, the mirror system was ahead of its time. It also highlighted the value of field-driven innovation. Large organizations tend to innovate from the top down. Requirements are written, solutions are engineered, products are tested and deployed. But in combat, the environment changes too quickly for that process alone. The mirror system came from the opposite direction. A user encountered a problem, experimented within his constraints, and shared the result organically. This bottom-up approach carried risks. Unofficial modifications could fail or create new hazards. But when they succeeded, they often did so precisely because they were grounded in lived experience. The tail gunner knew exactly where his problem was because he faced it every mission. Military planners took note. In later conflicts, feedback loops between operators and designers became more formalized. Rapid prototyping, user testing, and iterative design became standard practice. While no one pointed directly to a small mirror in a bomber's tail, the underlying philosophy had roots in experiences like that one. For the men who flew the missions, post-war life brought its own challenges. Many struggled to explain what they had done and why it mattered. The mirror system was not something you could point to on a map or measure in territory gained. Its impact was personal and statistical rather than dramatic. It showed up in who came home and who did not. Some veterans kept the mirrors as souvenirs, others never spoke of them again. Time moved on. Jets replaced propellers, missiles replaced guns. The idea of a man alone in the tail of an aircraft manually defending against attackers faded into history. But the core lesson remained relevant. Technology does not exist in isolation. It exists in relationship with the human being who uses it. When that relationship is ignored, performance suffers. When it is respected, even small changes can produce large effects. The mirror system did not make tail gunners fearless. It did not remove danger. What it did was restore a sense of agency. Instead of reacting blindly, the gunner could act with intention. That shift changed behavior, outcomes, and confidence. Tripling accuracy, in this context, was not about numbers on a chart. It was about reducing wasted effort and increasing meaningful action. Fewer rounds fired in panic, more fired with purpose. More attackers deterred, more crews surviving to fly again. History often remembers the loudest innovations, the biggest machines, the boldest strategies. Quiet improvements tend to be forgotten, even when they save lives. The mirror system belongs to that quieter category. Its legacy is subtle but real. It reminds us that sometimes the most powerful breakthroughs come not from adding complexity, but from seeing a problem differently.